Hello, podcast fans. Welcome back to another episode. Please hit that subscribe button. Would appreciate that very much. It takes less than a second and helps the podcast out. So Jeff Brown is on the show today. And yeah, this is a good podcast. Really appreciated Jeff and his way of seeing the world and his calling out of certain ideologies and teachings that in large might not be doing the good. It might be doing more bad than good. Subscribing to an idea without questioning it, without viewing things through reality, for example. This isn't just about, a science, materialistic way of viewing the world. Certainly not. There's lots of things we can't measure, but we know are there. Now, it isn't that. It's actually viewing things with a grounded sense of what makes us human, which is at the core of the podcast. So Jeff's an ideal guest, really. He's really viewing it from that lens of what makes us human. And then are we buying into ideas that are actually bypassing that humanness and not embodying all of you in the process, which is where healing, occurs. It's accepting, loving those parts of you that might be in fear, might be living in protection modes when it's not necessary. And these things are the things that hold us back at the end of the day. So I won't say too much more. There's a lot in the podcast. Expect to learn lots about the responsibility factor. Is everything our responsibility when life happens? Is it on us? The radical responsibility, which sometimes we're sold, is that even a thing? And is it better to surround yourself with positive people or people who are actually more real? And what actually that even means. What does reality mean? So we get into all of this. And yes, as I said, subscribe if you can. Appreciate your time. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye.
It's like, is your habitual range of emotion expanded and open and available to every experience? Or there's some ways in which you've tightened yourself up, shut yourself down so that you can only access certain feeling states while bypassing others?
I want to say that your work has actually helped me somewhat in, I guess I've got an addiction to discomfort. It's like I always seek to find the things that are making me uncomfortable in a healthy way sometimes, but then also it's a good check-in to see what makes you uncomfortable and why that is. So your work, I've only recently come across it. We took it in the last month. Watched Carmageddon, and I was like, okay, I see this guy's humanity. I see his mission. I see his overarching kind of values, and yeah, he's a truth seeker. And since delving into your work, got to admit, not read any of your books, but I will do. And it just speaks to the part of me that's like, okay, check in on my own bias. Like, what have I been fed? And what have I bought into, which is really like, it could be the bedrock of what you're really, who you're speaking to really, and what parts of people you're speaking to, just to checking in on that truth that perhaps could be guiding the way, but then is it really helping? Is it really, the thing that is going to help you essentially?
Well, I mean, we've been sold a sort of a karmic bill of goods, I believe, as to what spirituality is. And it's presented as often presented as very expansive and awakened, but in my experience, it's quite a limited construct that actually precludes the possibility of what I would consider to be, a true actualization of the human experience. So I think it really is time for us to acknowledge that if those spiritualities were so right on, the species wouldn't be in so much trouble. And that it's time to try to birth new methodologies that are more inclusive, more embodied, more heart-centered, and less oriented in the direction of becoming a so-called master in a state of perpetual realization. It's just, this stuff's starting to just feel ridiculous in many ways.
Yeah, as I'm sure we can get into, but once that kind of, it's almost a veil that does somewhat get removed, and you think, okay, let's take this through the lens of reality. Is it a goal of so many people to be this word enlightened, to sit on a rock and disconnect almost from their bodies and choose when to leave the earth. And is that really what you should be aiming for? It's
Yeah.
this certain image, isn't it, that we kind of, yeah, we put on that pedestal ourselves, I think.
Well, I mean, it may have served some sociological purpose in horrifying circumstances for people to, begin to pull away from detach. I mean, I say detachment is a tool, it's not a life, but at certain stages of human development in certain sociological contexts, detachment was the only way you could survive. So I'm all for it as a survivalist construct, but I'm not all for it as a persistent way of being in the world where it's possible to live more fully and more completely right in the heart of your body. There's this interesting poster image for this film. I think it was called 2012 or something, this John Cusack film. And in the poster image, you see all of these sort of Buddhist monks at the top of a mountain, seemingly in sort of, they've living in the silence, the stillness, the emptiness, because that's patriarchal spirituality wants to convince us that those are the paths or part of the path. And so they're like up there in some sort of state of meditative repose. And then you see the waters coming over the mountain that are just about to kill them. And for me, it just reveals the kind of idiocy of the delusion that somehow they've got it all worked out while pulling away from the world, living on the top of the mountain, because here comes the wave that's going to end their lives. And I would call that, the contrast between something called enlightenment and something that I would call enrealment. They're both right there in that poster image. And I think that's the state of the world that we're in right now in this kind of crisis and on a whole lot of different levels. And I think if we don't get in our bodies and grounded in reality and living in reality and bringing our energy purposefully into reality, we're not going to be able to save our species from its own trappings.
Yeah, I often feel about war, and I've kind of been posed with this question of like, what would actually happen if the government decided to go to war and I was to go to war? Like, I've been in kind of yogic circles for the last 10 years. I did teacher training, and obviously a big part of their teachings is non-violence and do no harm. And it's kind of like the underlying principles of like lots of ideologies. And then you think, well, what would happen? Would it, if it came to that? Why is this being taught? It feels very irrational to even say do no harm when we know it's a real factor, and it's really important to actually protect yourself if it was to come to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's dissociation that's, or self-avoidance or reality avoidance that masquerades as awakening. I mean, that's what that is. They're not grounded in reality. They're selecting a particular singular thread of consciousness and seeking to master that. I call that masturbation, and then they build the whole world ritualistically around it. They change their names often. They wear particular clothing. It's actually an incredibly disciplined structure quite often in the do no harm yogic world. That's kind of interesting. In many ways, they're doing a lot of harm to themselves in the disciplinarian nature of it. So I just think it's riddled with contradiction. It's non-duality, so-called unity consciousness, while removing the ego, the mind, the body, the story, the feelings. Everything human is removed from the awakened equation. I wrote about this in Grounded Spirituality at length, but I was watching these kind of Advaita people, I call them the Avoida movement, because they were very flatlined energetically. They were very kind of Eckhart Tolle, kind of very robotic and automaton-esque. And they were talking about unity consciousness, and I couldn't feel any aliveness coming off of them. And I understand why they did that. It's too uncomfortable to deal with all of these unresolved wounds, traumas, issues, the human experience. So they posited an awakened state that allows them to frame or characterize all of that as somehow sub-spiritual. So humanity, our humanness and our spirituality get pitted against each other rather than finding our spirituality right at the heart of our humanness. Because to do that means you've got to come back down into the body and deal with all the unresolved material, and they don't want to. And then a whole system is born, and many methodologies are born and birthed out of this desire to get away from the discomfort of being a human being, and to claim that there's some awakened place you can strive for that exists independent of your humanness, as though you can transcend being a human being and call that awakening and float away like birds or something. It's when you really look closely at it and you see through the veils of it, it all just seems childish and silly. And at the same time, occasionally I'd like to be able to bypass in exactly that way, because it is uncomfortable. It's been very uncomfortable for a few years in our culture and in our species. But I think it's fine to consciously bypass when you need to survive. But at some point, we got to come back down into the body and deal with what we're carrying. Because if we don't, we're never going to be able to do anything to affect positive change. Yeah.
Do you feel in some of these spiritual teachers, it's all in the subconscious, that there's that avoidant nature that's just trying to get away from the uncomfortable, and it's gravitating, focusing on that higher trajectory?
Yeah, the higher than, channeling, as though the greatness of the human experience all exists independent of the human experience. It's like riddled with irony if you think about it. Yeah, I mean, I tend to think as the guru is basically the most fucked up person in the room. They are so good at this game they're playing that they can convince thousands of people that the game they're playing ain't a game anymore, you know? And I don't think, I mean, some of them are conscious. I've interacted with some of them that'll say, here's a line that I use that gets me followers. I mean, they know what they're doing, some of them, but I think a lot of them don't. I think Eckhart Tolle may really believe that he's enlightened, you know, and that he went from suicidal to enlightenment in one night. I mean, he may really need to believe that. And I think for a lot of them, if they can convince enough people that what they're saying is true, they can continue to convince themselves.
Mm-hmm. What about MOOJI? I want to talk about MOOJI. How do you feel about
he's so cute.
Guy?
You know, when I feel really uncomfortable, I go on YouTube and I find this one MOOJI video where they're singing to MOOJI. And it just makes, and I just allow myself to just get into this place of feeling, okay, give it over to the MOOJ, baby. Just give it over to the MOOJ. Just let go of the self and give it over to the MOOJ. But, you know, then I listen to what he says, and it's classic spiritual bypassing. And always, it's with the bypassing gurus, you have to understand they always say things that are wise. It's not like everything they say isn't what, that's the hook. Some of the things really make sense, but if you really go down to the underpinnings of the system that they're bringing forth, it really is dissociated. So now when I look at MOOJI, except in those moments when I really want to pretend MOOJI's got it all worked out, I look at MOOJI and I just think he's silly. I just think it's silly. And that the people there are ironically trauma survivors who just really desperately need to God-jectify something.
As with a lot of these communities, right? It's almost like seeking community,
seeking belief, but masquerading as seeking enlightenment. You know, it's fine to say, it's been hard down here. I really need to go sing with MOOJI. I just really need to pretend MOOJI's got it all figured out. It's fine, as long as you come back home to yourself and to your body at some point along the way.
Isn't that his message, though, to really, you know, for me, it's quite simple. And I don't, you know, I've sat a few satsangs, and I went to see him in India, and it's really just saying one thing, that, you know, you're not your thoughts, and you can be the observer, and you can sit behind your kind of humanness, and everything is as it is right now. And that's just if you accept that, then it makes life a lot easier.
Well, it makes life, I mean, we could call that a sleepening, rather than awakening. I mean, living inside of the witness observer. I mean, one of the primary aspects of most patriarchal spiritualities is to blame the mind for all your problems. And interestingly, and they talk about the monkey mind ad nauseum. And my experience was, I call it the monkey heart. I can read a quote from Grounded about this because it's very important to me. My belief is that the agitated nature of the mind, the repetitive nature of the mind, is usually a function of unresolved emotional issues that are held in the body, what I call the monkey heart. So you have a good cry and your mind calms down. You have a good rage and your mind calms down. So they're playing this little game of getting inside the mind, witnessing the mind, which is really a mind function, in order to tame the mind. And if you do it for 16 hours a day, you will eventually appear to have tamed your mind until you stop meditating. And then the stuff comes back up from the body and begins to agitate the mind again. So it's a perfect setup for failure. And it's a perfect setup for telling people they just aren't doing it well yet. They haven't done enough of it yet. And they just need to show up more often and pay the bill to remain within the community itself. And eventually you'll be able to be like Master MOOJI, who no longer has any issues and just smiles and giggles all the time because he somehow has mastered his mind. I think he's just smiling and giggling all the time because he doesn't really have to work anymore. And he has a whole community of people who are foolishly chasing after him, thinking he's the dude, objectifying. I mean, that's a pretty good job on this planet. You get sung to, glorified. It's fantastic. It's like you're a rock star, but you just have to sit there. You don't even have to pick up an instrument. It's what a life.
Yeah, and become very disconnected from your physical self in doing so.
Absolutely.
You feel that. You feel that. And then what you say about what's his name? Ulrich Tolle.
Yes, his real name is Ulrich. So here's the guy. This is so great, Chris. This is the guy who's talking about formlessness, namelessness. The truth is emptiness, all this stuff. But meanwhile, and the dissolution of the so-called ego. Meanwhile, he was egoic enough to change his name to Eckart because he said he had a dream, I believe, where he saw books of Meister Eckhart and he wanted to be himself like a famous author. So, this is the guy who's bashing form and formlessness, who meanwhile feels it's necessary to change his name, to dissociate from his history and to present himself as a new version of Ulrich. It's all a scam. It's all a scam. It's just a scam. They're just charlatans. It's all it is. I mean, none of these people are, see, the way I define spirituality and grounded, spirituality is reality. So let's say if we could be quantitative for a moment, the most spiritual person is the one who's holding the greatest number of threads of reality at one time. They're not doing that. They're perfecting singular threads, say a meditative consciousness, and getting very good at that. And they can teach that. But they're not actually spiritual because many other parts of their lives are unresolved, underdeveloped, often a complete shit show. I can tell you things about some of these people that, nobody knows, but I have been told by people who know. And, there's no congruity between many aspects of their life. So when I was making Karmageddon, I asked a bunch of the Neem Karoli Baba people, I call them the Neem team, men. And I said, I don't get it. Bhagavan Das claims he's enlightened, and yet there's an absence of integrity in all these parts of his life. I said, how could you claim to be enlightened if there's no congruity on these levels? And they all said the same thing, which is very convenient for these men. They said, enlightenment comes to who it comes to, Jeff. You don't have to work on your issues. You don't have to be in integrity. You don't have to be a good person. It just comes to who it comes to. And of course, the unstated finish to that paragraph was, and by the way, Jeff, it came to me, right? So that's the game. And Ram Dass, who himself was a spiritual bypasser, to his credit in Karmageddon said, you have to be able to justify yourself on every plane of awareness. So that was closer to my view of what real spirituality is, where there's inclusivity and fluidity with respect to all your parts and aspects, and they're all moving in the same direction, rather than seeing yourself as a highly spiritual being when every single part of your human life is a shit show. To me, that's not spirituality.
Yeah, I feel like you went on a bit of a journey, and that was what made such good, watching for the documentary, that you came full circle in the end. I feel in the middle of it, it felt like you're questioning whether your own projection of what we've been conditioned into, the idea of lovers and age and all this kind of cultural relevant stuff. And the question was whether it's our projection of what is kind of good and bad, right and wrong within all of that.
Well, so
Would you say that?
you're talking about the interaction with the parents of the girl.
Yeah, pretty much. Like it's a common occurrence. Bikram and loads of spiritual, definitely yoga communities of these, leaders who then, fall for young women, and then it becomes very misleading and very very gray area.
Well, I don't think it's gray. I think they're just criminal. They're just criminals. I don't think it's very gray. I think they'd like to convince you it's gray to keep you baffled and confused and showing up and paying the toll to listen to them. But see, my view is that the game is simple. It's like basically you present a model that suggests that spirituality, a truly awakened spiritual being, exists independent of common sense humanists, right? So, common sense humanist says not every horrible thing is good for me. But in these systems, these mind fucking systems, it's set up so that the people in the audience are both confused and led in the direction of believing that none of the things we've been told are true, that's the matrix, as though the spiritual community isn't a matrix on its own. And the brilliant thing about this community is it set it up so there's no gossiping allowed, no judgment, no anger. That was set up so the guru could continue to sleep with young ladies. And it's the only element of society that I've experienced where when you start to critically review it, people come after you and say, how dare you critically review the guru? And usually those are people who follow the guru, who have a desperate need, not only to believe that the guru has it all figured out, the father or the mother figure that they've never, ever been able to look up to, but they also, because they themselves are trauma survivors on the flight from their own stuff, want desperately to find a way to hold that system, not just the person, it's the symbology of the person. But when they're singing to MOOJI, what they're singing to is a system that allows them to remain disconnected from their unresolved woundedness. And that's why many of these people ultimately often suicide, because they fire their therapist, they get hooked into new age or patriarchal spiritualities, and then their stuff is still inside of them. It hasn't gone anywhere. And eventually it begins to rise into consciousness. And at some point, the name changing, the new costumes, the new geography, aren't working anymore because their internal geography is still so deeply unresolved, and often they end up ending their lives. I've dealt with so many people, family members, after the fact, who've lost people to joining these communities. They experienced some kind of nirvana for a brief period of time, but eventually their stuff came right back to the surface. It just doesn't work for very long.
Why is the name changing on its own? Is that spiritual bypassing, or is it kind of more of a, there's things around that definitely spiritual bypassing?
I think it depends on why you're name changing.
I thought about that. It's the intention, of course.
Yeah, and I do think that there are some times in our lives where changing name or changing geography or changing all kinds of things are essential to trying a new way of being on for size and disconnecting from an unhealthy world. But I think it's also often fundamental to the spiritual bypass. Like Ram Dass is, his name isn't Ram Dass. The man's name was Richard Alpert. So, and there were many people who would call him on that. And Tim Leary, I think, was one of them who would confront him on this monkey business. And I understand that for him, it gave him a sense of his own. He'd been fired from Harvard, and now he had sort of a sense of his place in the world. And egoically, I think on many levels, he liked that. But, when it came down to it, if you really talked about the nitty gritty of his childhood and his family history, it was very evident that he was not in a place of resolution with his family, not with his family relationally, but within his internal family in relation.
Yeah, I think I remember him. One of his quotes was, and it resonated, you think you're enlightened until you spend a week with your parents again.
Yes, but then he would reference himself as enlightened. So this is the nonsense.
I know, yeah.
That's, This is the nonsense of it. It's one thing to say, listen, I've learned some things along the way. I have some things to offer you. But when you start calling yourself enlightened, like it's like a finished process, you just reveal yourself to be a bit of an idiot, to be quite honest. It's idiotic. Yeah.
Yeah. And to the enrealment. So you talk about stillness as well, which I want to touch upon. Because for me, stillness has been excellent, in the crazy modern day, lots going on.
Yep.
And of course, no one can deny getting some stillness now and again is important. But can we cultivate more stillness to then get to know the center, get to know what's in our heart, to drop into our heart, to regulate the nervous system, to seek stillness, to then drop down into our heart space and understand ourselves more through that stillness?
Yeah. So I was just writing about that in a course that I'm working on yesterday. So for me, some of the primary things you'll find with these, what I call patriarchal spiritualities, is this obsession with stillness and silence as sort of primary to the path of awakening. And I certainly benefited as a person who was always in motion and hyperactive from learning how to still myself, learning how to be present for silence, to see what came up, to see what was uncomfortable about it, to trace the threads back to the source of the discomfort. It's important. It's part of an enrealed consciousness to be able to access all states of being. But when you buy into a system that is only about stillness and silence, then you're buying into a dissociated spiritual bypass system, because my belief is the reason why they created that was because movement and sound excavated all their unresolved woundedness. It's all about trauma avoidance. So it makes sense that if you can just learn to master stillness and silence and disconnect from the world, you no longer have to confront how crazy you are after a period of time. It becomes like a drug trip, like a stillness drug trip. So that's what you have to be aware of, and that's what you have to be careful not to plunge too deeply into, but to utilize stillness and silence as some of the tools in terms of you're wanting to figure out who you are, why you're here, and to move towards something we might call wholeness. There's no reason to have an issue with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the dissociation, could you just define what you mean when you say dissociation? Is it really just dissociating from sensory experience, the self, disconnecting from, changing your name would be disconnecting from your old self, which is still you. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think primarily, dissociating from that which makes us human. So the self, the story, the ego, the blessed ego that gets dissed so horribly by these people while being completely ruled by their unhealthy egos, our emotions as illusion, that monkey business, so that at the end of the day, there's not really much left of the human to move into a non-dual field, because it's all been desecrated. And so I think dissociation was the word that just kept coming to mind. I'd be walking with Bhagavan Das towards the end, and I'd be, this guy's not even inside of his humanness. They talk about self-realization, but they're not talking about the actual realization of the localized self. They're talking about you're finding this sort of absolute amorphous self-experience and bypassing the localized self. And for me, self-realization means nothing if I'm not including all of the aspects of my humanness. That's the self I want to realize. I want to know what's inside of this story, what healing and transformations inside of my pain body memory, what callings, what sacred purpose lives at the heart of this Jeffrey Lorne Brown character. I'm fascinated by that, and I think all the answers lie right inside of that story. But our stories are painful, so it makes sense why they posited a system where you find your true path, if we even use those terms in that context, in some absolute amorphous empty self field. They want to empty it because the closer they get to fullness, the more quickly and readily they confront their material. It's just self-avoidance masquerading as enlightenment. That's just the sense. And for me, presence is a whole being experience. It's not just becoming a perfect little meditator. That wouldn't interest me. I would like to develop in all kinds of other aspects of my human experience and enjoy the duality of the human experience without trying to flee it in the name of something called awakening.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree that meditation, breath work, certain practices, these are tools and techniques we can use, but ultimately they are symptom relief?
Well, it depends why you're going there. So meditation, I think it was Ken Wilber wrote in one of the books, there were many of the books, that meditation is like the royal road to the kingdom of God. I may not be quoting him exactly, but and I was read that and thought, really, a dance isn't lovemaking,
Mm-hmm.
holotropic breath work, aliveness, energy, movement, interactions, relational ability. I mean, so, this is the bias of the discombobulated meditator. At the same time, I've utilized meditation at various times to help me to step back a little, get a broader perspective, remember that I have a body. You can meditate as an addictive practice and never connect to your body, or you can meditate in a way that connects you to your body. But I think at the end of the day, we need to move our bodies. That's why I liked holotropic breathwork so much, because it was energized. I feel like we're so armored, overwhelmed, and not exactly still because we're agitated in Western culture, but there's a way in which we're kind of frozen in timeless in a way, both with respect to all of our emotional holdings and also just the agitation of living in such a hemmed in cultural experience, where I do think the way we function is manipulated by a small percentage of people, elitists, who benefit from it. I now really see that, and I believe that's true. And so I think it's really important for us to move, and really important for us to, but move with the intention of clearing debris, energizing our system, coming back to life, not moving in an attempt to avoid or distract from our human experience. So it's all about why you're doing it. And you can meditate as part of your wholeness path, and it's beautiful. You can meditate as a drug trip. I mean, meditation is medication, and never really get anywhere with respect to your own evolution. The character I wrote about in Grounded Spirituality, you would love this book. I interact with him for 8 or 9 chapters or 12 chapters. He comes to me as a bypasser saying, it's not working anymore, Jeff. So we go through a process of getting him more here, like really here, and then asking, why are you here? Because once you get here, your question is, why am I here? And so we go through this whole process, and it's very clear that he's perfected the art of meditation as an avoidance practice and as a certain kind of self-connection practice. But in every single part of his life where all of those threads move outward into the world relationally and all the rest of it, he has absolutely no skills. And the meditation has prevented him from developing those skills. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you work with people one-on-one physically?
Yeah, I do. Oh, I do session work. Yeah, but in this, I imagined a character that was like
Sure.
a conglomeration of people I've known and me at various stages on the path. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's powerful. Yeah, you said something about the power of now. We have this obsession with the now, don't we? But then it's
What does it
interesting
mean?
that
What does
what
it
does it
mean?
mean?
What I
Just
mean,
a
to be
word.
present. I mean, these things all sound very good. The power of now.
But what you said was that how can you be in the now if you're projecting your past into the now
Well, I call it the
constantly?
power of then. I mean, I call him Dead Heart Tolle. When I see Tolle talking in that stupery way he talks, I don't feel any presence coming off. There's no energy. It just feels like a robot's talking to me. So I would watch him and go, "This is the now. That's the power of now." I mean, that's not going to change this world. He may have a
So
few.
would you say Tony Robbins is the opposite?
Well, I would say Tony feels like that's mania to me, and Eckart just feels like depression to me. So like together, they're sort of like, for me, they're like manic depression. And it just feels too hyped up and extreme to me. It doesn't feel grounded. None of them feel grounded. Tony feels like he's way up and off of the body in many ways. And that's his, this is how he brings people to this message and this work, whatever it is. But I sort of imagine, I met this guy named Alexander Lowen, who was the co-founder of Bioenergetics, and I worked with him therapeutically for a while. And Lowen he felt grounded, present, energized, like a little bit like a Mustang. He had a lot of vitality, brightness coming off his eyes, really sharp mind, but you could just feel that his feet were on the earth. And for me, presence is a whole being experience. So when Tolle is talking about the power of now, I'm thinking, well, I don't know about that. I mean, what about the power of then? Because every time people talk to me about being in the now, including Ram Dass, Richard Alpert talking about being here now, meanwhile, they keep changing their names. It's like, I understand you're escaping to a version of the present that gives you relief. But what about all that unresolved Richard Alpertness? What about all that unresolved horrible childhood of Ulrich Tolle? And it's not gone. It's still in the cells. It's not fully released and resolved. So how can you talk about the now if it seems to me that you're still being completely ruled by the then? And then that attracts all the rest of us who want to escape our true nowness, which includes being inside of our bodies, because we're looking for some moment of relief. And again, if they just call it relief, I don't got a problem. But when you call it a field guide to enlightenment, then I have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's a marketing ploy, but it's not true.
Yeah. So how does one clear the clutter of the past, of the shame, the guilt? What work do you do with people?
The anger and the grief. And well, I usually send people to somatic psychotherapists. I have a number of people that I recommend people to who will work deeply. See, to me, somatic psychotherapists, body-centered psychotherapists are more like real spiritual teachers, because for me, they're getting into the guts of the human, excavating and accessing all the unresolved woundedness, all the unresolved words, all the unstated words, all the unexpressed anger and grief, and inviting through various techniques release of the material so the person can reconnect with where they come from, become a more integrated person who's not living in defenses, adaptations, and disguises, and actually get more present in their bodies, real presence, right? So when I said to Lowen, I said, because I was never into spirituality, I was into psychotherapy. I said, what are they talking about when they're talking about spirituality? I mean, he said, spirituality. He goes, you ground yourself, you clear your, I'm paraphrasing, you ground yourself, you energize your body, you clear your holdings, you become naturally spirited, naturally present. That's real spirituality. And I was like, that's my experience too. I'd go into a sessions feeling this separateness in my consciousness. I would leave the session feeling like I had entered like a unified field of awareness through the release of the holdings in my body. I didn't have to meditate forever. I just felt like the emotional release was a spiritual practice that brought me more deeply into the present. So, but they don't want to do that. You know, they want to sit in stillness and silence and find various ways to avoid and energizing. You have to energize the holdings. They're frozen, they're armored. Depression is frozen feeling. You have to bring that material to life in the body in order for it to come to the surface and reveal itself and then present itself for release. It's very hard to do all of that when you're just sitting still.
Mm-hmm. It's very hard to do that when you're not as well.
Yeah, no, well, and then there's cultural issues. I get all of that, but I do like the holotropic breathwork model, somatic psychotherapies like bioenergetics, core energetics, because they're really release focused and they're grounded at the same time. They're not like primal scream, where there was really no grounding. There was just primaling and releasing. They really help you to come back into your feet, come back into your body, and reintegrate yourself.
Yeah, I think that's massively important. And I get a lot from moving my body, just going out, having no agenda, and just moving my body in a natural way with no tools and just me and the earth. And it does a lot to kind of move energy and shift things and get me into my body. That seems to be a better way for me. Have you heard of Richard Schwartz and the internal family systems?
Yeah, he read Grounded Spirituality. He loved it. And then I did 2 interviews on my YouTube channel with Richard. Yep.
Oh, you did?
Yep. Yeah,
Nice.
I was doing parts work all my life. I was naming my parts as a teenager. So I think it's really important to recognize and identify parts to distinguish defenses, adaptations, and disguises as in the form of parts from something called the core self or the soul self. And I think it's incredibly important work. His work isn't really cathartic work. It's more sense-making work. And I think it's an important part of the process. And I don't think you have to do it with IFS. You can just sit down and ask yourself, what's the real me? How do I know what the real me is? And what are all of these other aspects? Where did they come from? What birthed them? You can name them. And are they still serving me, or is it time to invite them to move on out of my daily consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Would you say most people's kind of challenges and obstacles are really, unhealthy patterns learned or coping mechanisms or ways of protecting oneself through, fear of something, basically from previous experience? And
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of feeling around that. Like there's a lot of, I think most humans that I know, without even necessarily themselves realizing it, are carrying an enormous amount of justified anger. Um, we vilified anger in the spiritual community, of course, because then the guru could get away with everything. But we have vilified anger all throughout society, and this is how we're continuing to control. So I think it's really time for us to resuscitate anger, healthy anger release, as part of a regular, even daily practice if necessary. Alexander Lowen, into his 90s, was doing tantrimming in the morning on this mattress he had in this dusty old room of his. And, he would do like 300 arm kicks and leg kicks. And I said, are you doing that just because you have to keep discharging the primal history, your childhood history? And he said,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure, there's all that. But I'm also trying to discharge the culture,
Wow.
the culture that keeps me away from the acknowledgement that I have an animal body, and that I have a deeply feeling animal body, and that wants me to armor my body so that I'm no longer in a place of feeling where I can now be more easily manipulated. So it was all there. And I think just a tantruming practice on the mattress is a fantastic way to discharge stuff that you don't want to carry with you for the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you mean by armoring the body in this context?
Well, I get massaged constantly, including later today. And, because I learned the difference between what felt like a more fluid, open, and integrated body, and a body that was tightly armored. You can armor your consciousness through the shallowing of the breath, so you don't really feel deeply inside of yourself, because deeper breath brings up deeper feeling. Shallow breath, shallow feeling. Um, you can armor parts of your musculature without realizing it. Many people have super tight necks and live in their heads, and it's a mechanistic way to keep themselves from the enlivening of the body and from the movement of the body energy and the body feeling up into the mind. So they survive by their wits, trapped inside of it with really tightly armored necks, shoulders. You start working deeply in the neck and shoulder area, and then the
Mm-hmm.
feeling starts to drop down back into the body starts to inform the mind, so the relationship between the two is a healthier one, and you start to experience reality not as an armored tank, but as a fluid feeling based organism, which is, I think, the way we're supposed to. So eventually, if you do that work for long enough, you still armor, but it becomes a conscious armoring process, not an automatic way of being, a way of functioning that developed in response to childhood circumstances, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. So much to learn there, but then just so much to practice, and
Well, there, well,
experience for
well, there
yourself.
is, but I don't think it's so difficult. I think that we just have to grant ourselves permission. That's the difficult part,
Mm.
to feel and experience everything as part of this brilliant life. So, for example, if you were to look at yourself, Chris, and identify, if you feel like sharing, what ways do you armor yourself? What ways do you cut off your experience from the wholeness of the human form? Have you softened your edges too much? Have you shallowed your breath too much? I mean, what are the ways in which you've responded to life's challenges within the body itself? And how does that inform your access to various emotional states? Like, is your habitual range of emotion expanded and open
Mm-hmm.
and available to every experience? Or there's some ways in which you've tightened yourself up, shut yourself down, so that you can only access certain feeling states while bypassing others?
So dance could be a form of this, consciously sober on a dance floor and being aware of the way I'm moving my body and restricting it, moving certain ways, or perhaps ways that it feels like going, and then not doing that because of,
Because there's
perception.
some, well, and also because, and this happens with yoga often, asana that we're most uncomfortable with, if we actually force ourselves, excavates all kinds of old feelings and memories that are held in that
Mhm.
tight place. And that's why we don't want to go anywhere near it. So we stay in our, like I just keep doing sun salutes, but the moment I have to go back and bend backwards, I'm like, I can't do it on a now. So this is the interesting thing. The physical body, it is tighter in that way because it has developed partly in response to the need to repress the emotional material that's held in that part of the body. So the body becomes tight and inaccessible. And if you open it and make it accessible, there's a whole flood of feeling, memory, and sometimes expression that emerges.
Mhm.
So bioenergetics has a whole series of practices that are similar to asanas, except there's, instead of in the yogic world where there's an attempt often to bypass the emotional body by perfecting the physical body, in bioenergetics they use the asanas or the exercises in a way to access all the material held within the musculature and parts of the body, and then encourage the energized, spirited, grounded release of it so that you can become more truly self-possessed in the localized self, not self-possessed in the pseudo realized absolute self field. It's a very different
Mhm.
thing. Using yoga to perfect the body so you can become the perfect absolute self character, or using asanas and exercises in bioenergetics to actually excavate this localized self, the Chris self, what Chris is holding, what Chris is needing to release, Chris's story, the honoring of Chris's story, rather than the turning it around like Byron Katie, so that you can live in the heart of your story, learn and find the transformation at its heart. And so you experience this thing called spirituality from the heart of Chris rather than from the bird's eye view above him.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess a lot of it is, and even in yoga studios, you you don't go that far, or you can be very self-aware of how you looked at other people, and it can restrict you in that way. So there's like
Absolutely.
the fear of, and that manifests in the body, of course, because it's not going where it feels like it needs to go. Or I feel like a big fear for people is just not being accepted. I mean, it's just apparent in our culture, like it's very apparent how people move, how people walk, what people wear. And would you say that speaks to this?
I mean, it's interesting when yoga sort of took root in Toronto as a mainstream thing rather than as a select special thing. It was amazing how many people began strutting around town, even when they didn't need to, carrying their yoga mats in their tight Lululemon pants. And it was very obvious that it was a very unhealthily egoic path for many people. And part of the problem is, so I posited in Grounded Spirituality something I called just to use a term for it, barking dog yoga. So you create a yoga world that's not about becoming the most perfected yogi, but is about utilizing the mat as an emotional excavation tool. So obviously, yogis have to then become trained in something real, not just being really good stretchers and pretending they're enlightened masters at the age of 22. Um, and they have to actually develop some awareness of their own trauma history and get out of the unhealthy ego that struts around like the teacher and spews wisdoms at the beginning of class that make me want to throw up most of the time. But in any event, you have to utilize it so that you have a smaller group. Say you had 6 or 8 people who are really determined to use asana now, bridge the wisdom of the yoga practice with a Western consciousness around emotional release, the development of the healthy ego, solidifying of the healthy self concept, all that. So instead of people trying to contain their feelings in yoga, right, they're actually invited to release their feelings on the mat with various anger release techniques, grief release
Mm.
techniques, and they're held in that. So at the end of the class, they're not all stretched up but yet kind of blocked up at the same time because they had to put all the feelings away. They actually walk out of it opened up physically and opened up and released emotionally. To me, this is the next step for yoga. It's kind of what Phoenix Rising Yoga, I think, was doing one-on-one with people. I don't know if they were doing that in a class form. And I
Mhm.
think it's the next inevitable direction for yoga to go. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got a men's workshop this Saturday, and it's about 10 individuals. I don't know them. No, I don't know any of them actually. Never met any of them. It's a free workshop that I'm doing, and it's gonna. Would you say that without being trained in holding any kind of somatic kind of trauma releasing space, for lack of better words, what would you say would be a really effective practice to do with these men that are, it's a safe space, and that's going to be very clear from the off,
I
but
think
to
it would.
get them into their bodies, and yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're going to use yoga, if that's one of the tools,
It wasn't going to be. It's going to be natural movement. We'll be getting into cold
right.
water. We'll be gathering around a fire. We'll be
Then what I would say is utilize those practices. Introduce when you're introducing the practice to them, grant them permission, because they may need permission culturally, to, if emotion comes up, if memory comes up through the enlivening of the body, if woundedness they become connected to through the opening of the body, to grant themselves permission to not put that away, to honor it in whatever way they need to. If they need to express it, express it. If they need to pull off to the side of the room and just be with those feelings, to be with the feelings, and to let them know you'll do your best to hold the space for whatever comes up for them. I had this experience in Toronto at a place called Downward Dog Yoga that told me a lot about the yoga world. And I was with my buddy at the back, and we were laughing and just talking, and the teacher was teaching, and we were just being goofy. And he came over he was very disciplined downward dog guy, Ashtangi, like hardcore, series 1, series 2, the whole trip. And he really, so he comes over with a look on his face. We thought he was sort of kidding. And he says to us very firmly in front of 100 people, it's a full room. He said, "There is no laughing in yoga." And we laughed because we thought that was
You
the
laughed.
stupidest thing we'd ever heard. But he meant it. And this is what I understood. They were utilizing initially, if you look at the original writings of yoga, because I wrote a paper on this when I went to Saybrook, you look at the original writings, it was bypassing. It was really about perfecting the toxic body beast, not through acknowledging all the grief and anger you're feeling, but practicing the asanas in a very disciplined manner, in a way to get you to the stage where you're some kind of perfected automaton that really is not any longer connected to the shadowy material that you're holding in your musculature. And that's what he was saying. And I found out about him years later. This was a guy with an enormous number of personal issues, like lots of issues with law enforcement. And he found the thing that allowed him to tighten up, push down, contain that material. Ultimately, his life fell apart in British Columbia. But, it worked for as long as it worked for him, as a disciplined practice. But ultimately, I think we want to move yoga in the direction, and you can do that if you need to do a more disciplined way to get away from your chaotic self. But ultimately, I think we need to find a way to train people, to allow people to use the mat as a beautiful, brilliant emotional release cavern, where they feel safe, secure, and properly handled, not by silly egoic yogis, but by people who really understand the nature of trauma. And it's starting to happen. They're talking about being trauma informed. But I think now they need to be trauma trained, not just informed that there's this thing called trauma that might be inside of the body and might show up now and then on the mat, but really to know what to do with it. And to me, that would be just a beautiful evolution for the yogic world. Otherwise, think of the messed upness, Chris. It's like stuff's coming up, but you feel like in that cultural environment, you're not allowed to release it. It's not invited and supported. You feel even shame for feeling it because the other person beside you seems to be strutting their stuff perfectly. You don't see any indication of shame, grief, or anger. Of course, you don't know them. You don't know what they're feeling, but that's the perception. And to me, I would walk out of class sometimes kind of confused. It's like I felt stronger. I felt more stretched out, but I had all this feeling, and I was all feelinged up with no place to go. Yeah.
That's powerful.
So let's just move the stuff. That's all.
Yeah. Now I think you bang on with just being honest in that. If they wanted to, go sit aside, do whatever. It's like we also me and my partner, we hold space for ecstatic dance, and it's just all about the moving away from the judgment, the conversation, even just to do what you feel you want to do right now, and just synchronize yourself with the music, which has been, curated in a certain way to take you on a journey. And that's all it needs to be.
I used to do a lot of trance dance stuff, Gabrielle Roth stuff. I love the permission to just move in whatever direction my body wanted to move. But again, there still wasn't a real emphasis or a way of holding space for the
Cool.
release of anger and grief that comes up in the enlivening of the body. There's still a social mass going on there, and I think it's something worth talking about.
Yeah, I think you're right to call that.
A lot of spiritual bypassers love trance dance. I know a lot of
We
spiritual
do, yeah.
bypassers.
I'm definitely one.
They love trance dance, and because they go to the bliss, but
Yeah.
it's not always bliss,
Have you heard of Tim Morrison ever in Australia?
I have, but I don't know anything about him.
Yeah, might be worth. I think on Instagram he shares a lot of powerful stuff, which speaks to what we're discussing. I do want to, aware of the time, I do want to touch upon, which is kind of a side trap, but I wanted to bring it up. This the secret and the abundance and your thoughts and the positivity, which is, because it's thing is, when I said I was doing a podcast with you, so many friends were like, "Oh, amazing, love Jeff," and then the more and more research I did about you, I was like, well, that contradicts so many of these people who are, rooting for you on the podcast. And I'm like, there's so much going on here that almost like people love to belong to each category, which contradicts, and it's interesting. But anyway, so the law of attraction. Would you speak
Well,
to
you know
that
what
a little bit?
happens? Yeah, well, I will. I will. But it's
You don't sound too enthusiastic about it.
no. It's not that. It's that I feel like I was just following up on what you were saying. It's like
Yeah.
a lot of bypassers love my stuff. Like it's off
Yeah.
the charts, and
Yeah.
I'm asked, I said, what is going on here? Like then they go right back to bypassing. So it's like, so I think it's like some part of them goes, yeah, I think he's right, but I don't want to do all that work. So I'm just going to go back to bypassing. And the only work I'm going to do in the direction of grounding my spirituality is just reading Jeff Brown's posts and going, yeah, I think he's right.
Yeah. Love
And
that
then they go
quote.
back to the bypassing. So the law of, I think, I wrote a whole chapter on Grounded called the New Cage Movement, and, law of attraction-y stuff is part of it. I call it the law of no traction because it has no grounding in reality. And just the idea that you're just going to change your thoughts and that's going to change your entire interface with the universe. First of all, I think you can't really organically, authentically change your thoughts again until you interface with your emotional holdings, because most of your thoughts are emanating from. So I think you probably stand a better chance of getting the universe on board with your benevolent and positive intentionality and dreams if you get a true alignment between the emotional body and the way you're thinking and the way you're moving through the world. Just fixating again on the mind, back to the mind, cognitive mind, all with the mind, witnessing the mind, positivitying the mind. It works for a few minutes, and in certain circumstances, it's helpful as a motivator. But I think if we're talking about a true sustainable evolution of the individual organism, just do the work in the emotional body so that you get a true congruency between what you're feeling and what you're thinking, so that you're truly living an honest and authentic life. And then you're more likely to have some kind of a useful interface with this thing called the universe. And in my experience, if you do a lot of this work in yourself, you don't even look to the universe to save you anymore, because you're just in a state and you're functioning in a particular way of being that is just far more likely to lead to the kind of results that you're after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't feel the people who really buy into the law of attraction as looking to the universe to, save them, but more that it makes sense that on an energetic frequency, if you are more positive, you're going to attract positive people. There's a confirmation bias there going on, perhaps, because if you're negative, you want also negative people around you to kind of confirm that.
Yeah.
And it does. There is some evidence to.
Well, I think for me, the thing that I wanted around me was more real people. because I think if I have more real people around me, I'm in a posse of people that support my desire, which is to be able to be available emotionally for all aspects of the human experience. So,
Mm.
if you're wanting to arrive at a more naturally fluid, joyous, and pleasurable place where you are more likely to attract like-spirited others or like-minded others, then I think really going the enrealment way of developing your capacity to be here for all of this is ultimately going to be the way to manifest what it is that you want. And I mean, I'm all for positivity if it's authentic, and
Yeah, it
occasionally
gets
if it's a
toxic at
little
times.
forced. I call it perpetual positivity syndrome. And
Mm.
it's not all good. I mean, some things aren't good. There is needless suffering in this world, and so I think if we just live in the reality of that and do the work to clear the emotional debris that is obstructing our consciousness, we're more likely to attract all kinds of wonderful things that'll flow with that functioning way of being. But we got to do the work. And quite often those systems are designed to sell a product to people where they don't have to do the work again. And so when the secret came out, I knew so many people who sold their businesses, sold their houses, followed their dreams, stayed positively focused on becoming master yogis with a big yoga studio, and ultimately ended up sleeping in their cars. So I think there's something to be said for grounded spirituality, that is, getting a clear idea of where you'd like to go, and then just getting into reality to actually do the real work to manifest it.
Hmm. Yeah. Is this similar in terms of your, I guess, the responsibility that people feel everything is on them. Everything is, they're responsible for how they feel, and it's nothing external. Everything's
Yeah,
internal. Like,
as though we don't live in a context, and we aren't being manipulated by systems, and we aren't being held down by systems. I mean, it's
because I
that's
guess
not
you
realistic, right? I mean, there's a
can't feel.
sociology
Yeah,
to things.
there is. Yeah, it feels that's so like impossible to conceptualize that this thing is impacting me. Can't see it, feel it, look, understand it. So therefore, it's not. I'm just gonna say that I'm responsible for everything because that's more empowering.
So I think with all of these new cage notions, there's a healthy way of interfacing with them, and
Yeah.
there's an unhealthy place. And I think this is the discernment is very important with this. So growing up poor, believing I could change that reality was important for me,
Yeah.
as long as I coupled that belief with the willingness to do hard work. Um, and then I got somewhere. I created a different kind of reality. But my story is one of, I mean, I had a window business. I've knocked on more doors in North America probably than anybody in a 40-year period selling product. I mean, I'm a worker. So, and I've just seemed to get everywhere I want to go through working hard and learning how not to get in my own way. It was an important part of my own learning because of my family history. But I don't really understand wishful thinking. I'm goal centered, but I only check off the goal when I've worked hard to achieve it. So
Mm.
if we combine those things in a more balanced, stable, sustainable way, I think it's helpful to us. But
Yeah.
otherwise, I think it's really just wishful thinking masquerading again as some kind of a enlightened model.
Yeah, because you can be grounded in the reality of, okay, this is a useful way, an effective way of interacting with the world. That the power of belief is can change your chemistry, can change your your called epigenetics.
Sure, but I think if most people in our world are carrying an enormous amount of unresolved and unreleased emotional
Yeah.
material that will obstruct any of those good intentions if they're not tended to.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're all bunked up with stuff, you can practice all the new cage principles that you want. At the end of the day, not much is going to change in your life. But you've got to couple this benevolent intentionality with a willingness to get down into your feet and your bones and get reacquainted with what you're holding and do the work so that you become that kind of energized beacon that is more likely to attract the kinds of things that will serve you. You know, if you think just wishful thinking is going to well, go ahead, but it's not going to get you anywhere. You'll see the occasional wishful thinking person win a lottery, for 30 million pounds or something. But they don't tell you about the other 84 million that bought the ticket and never won anything. So, I just think there's no substitute for real work on the path. But I realize I'm not talking about the path that we've been calling the path in the patriarchal and New Cage worlds. I'm talking about a very different, much more human, much more persistent, much more determined, much more courageous version of the path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man.
It's braver.
Been fun. He's braver.
Cool.
Thanks.
You're a
being
cool guy.
Courageous. Yeah,
Thanks.
Appreciate it. So obviously I'll drop all the links in the when you bring in this podcast out.
Yeah, I know. I got a
soon.
thing happening that's I'm waiting on, and it's just gotten in the way, but it's always coming soon. But I'm hopeful it'll be by September at the latest. In the meantime, I'm developing my Enrealment method. I'm teaching a grounded spirituality course at Shift Network shortly in June, I think. And then, we have all kinds of other things we're planning to do, most of which will show up somehow on jeffbrown.co, which is my main website.
Yeah. I'm excited to do one of your courses. Sure.
Thank you.
Right. Appreciate it, man. And I'll do my bit and share and let you know when it's out.
Great. Thanks, Chris.